Привет, друзья! G'day guys, welcome to another Soviet lens reviews video. As you might have guessed from the title, we're doing things a little bit differently today. We're not going to be looking at a Soviet lens, but instead we are going to be taking a look at Nikon's first autofocus zoom lens and seeing how it stacks up. So let's get into it. Alrighty guys, Alex here. Today we are shooting on the Mir 10A mounted on my Nikon Z6 with a 1/4 black mist filter on top of that. So first off, let's talk about this lens. This is the Nikkor 35-70 f3.3-4.5 AF Mark II version of this lens. Now, let's start off with some history about this lens. There was two versions of this lens originally made, first made in 1986 for Nikon's first autofocusing SLR cameras, this particular AF version. The Mark II, which is my version of this lens, was made originally in 1989 and manufactured all the way through to 1994. And what's interesting about this kind of batch of lenses is that there was a batch made originally in Japan, and then towards the later stages of manufacturing, Nikon ended up outsourcing the manufacture of this lens to Thailand. And you can actually tell if you have a serial number beginning with 5, then your lens is manufactured in Thailand. Also, of course, you have the made in Japan there as well, which indicates that mine is one of the slightly earlier batches of this lens. Now, although this was Nikon's first autofocusing zoom lens, they had made a few 35-70s before, or a couple of other zoom lenses as well that were roughly in that range. This was the first AF zoom for the Nikon 501 in 1986, and the Nikon, they did have a 35-70 with the exact same optical design, but in manual focus prior to constructing this lens. Although this was, really kind of part of Nikon's drive to get people converting over to autofocus, get people converting over to their modern AF SLRs. Now, there is some incorrect speculation on the internet, in fact, by Ken Rockwell himself, who is a bit of a Nikon guru. He's got it wrong on his site because he says that this 35-70mm lens is actually made by Cosina, and that's not the case. The Nikon lens with the zoom range of 35-70 that was made by Cosina actually has a lower aperture range. So it actually goes from f3.5 through to f4.8. So it's about 1/6 of a stop of light less for that lens made by Cosina. So basically, as long as your lens is f3.3 to f4.5, you don't have to worry about it being that lower quality version manufactured by Cosina. This is a real Nikon lens. On to some tech specs about this lens. So this lens is the Mark II version, and as part of that, it means that it is 240 grams, which is lighter than the Mark I by about 20 grams. And it's actually a really cheap lens as well. I got mine for free as a pass me down from my grandfather, but you can pick one up on eBay now for £35. I saw one listed just today. They are very mass manufactured lenses, and they're really common at the end of the day, so you can get one for fairly cheap. Now, in terms of some other tech specs, it does have a 52mm filter thread. The body is made primarily out of plastic, although it is a metal lens mount. There is no weather sealing gasket to this lens. And there's no depth of field scale as well. So if you're a photographer like myself that likes a good DOF scale, then you're unfortunately not going to get it in this lens. Now, it focuses from 0.3 meters at the closest kind of macro, it's marked focusing range, all the way through to infinity. Of course, has that zoom range of 35 to 70 mils. And at 35 mil, you're going to be at f3.3. And then as you zoom in, it will stop down a little bit from that to the aperture of f4.5. Now, in terms of aperture blades, this has 7 aperture blades. Nikon did a great job of making the aperture of this zoom lens because it creates really nice bokeh and it's not too ugly. I think Arsenal could have learned a lesson or two from Nikon with regards to how they make their aperture blades. One other cool feature of this lens is when you're zoomed in to 70mm, you can actually stop down further than f22. You can go all the way to f32, which if you do decide to shoot at that aperture means you can get some pretty creative kind of longer exposure shots. When it comes to mounting it to my camera, my Nikon Z6, I use the F to Z adapter and it screws in there with no trouble whatsoever, just like, well, just about any Nikon lens manufactured in the past 50, 60 years. Bam, you're in, easy peasy. Now, unfortunately, in terms of the AF, it is a screw drive AF in this lens, which means that it doesn't actually have autofocus when you're mounting it to a Nikon Z series camera, but everything else works, and you can set the aperture digitally via the camera, and that actually makes shooting a bit of a breeze compared to what I'm used to, which is, of course, most of my Soviet lenses where all of the aperture is fully manual. Okay, we've talked about tech specs. Let's get into some photos and photo characteristics of this lens. Starting off with sharpness. I ran this lens through a few sharpness tests using a program I wrote which uses an algorithm very similar to modern focus peaking algorithms to see just how sharp this lens is. And you can see the results here. Obviously wide open, particularly at 35mm. The AF Nikkor is not the sharpest kind of lens in the shed, particularly in the corners of the frame, but really when you stop this lens down, it is getting very, very, very sharp. And just anecdotally from using it, I love how sharp this lens is stopped down, as you can see in a bunch of these test shots here as well. Now, when it comes to bokeh, the quality of the bokeh that comes from the 35-70 here is very good, particularly for a zoom lens. You know, I've seen a few more modern zooms that have less nice looking bokeh than this lens. To be honest, even my Vario Zenitar K, again one of the very early Soviet zooms of approximately around the same time, does not have bokeh that looks as nice as this Nikkor. Now, in terms of contrast is kind of average across the frame. You are going to get a slightly warmer image with this Nikkor, as with kind of lots of particularly earlier Nikon lenses. And the two issues which I have with this lens are it does display a little bit of blooming, particularly at wider apertures and at 35mm. You can really see it when you've got a very strong light source that's kind of surrounded by some sort of dark occluded object. Chromatic aberration, it does show a little bit of fringing. Particularly when you're wide open. As you stop that down, that does disappear. Although thankfully there is not too much longitudinal chromatic aberration, which is the change in colors that you see at the edges of the depth of field planes of focus. Now, in terms of flaring, honestly, for a zoom lens made in the late 1980s, this lens performs really, really well. Of course, it does flare. You are going to get some flares with any sort of a zoom lens, but you know, Nikon did a great job with their coatings, and most of the flares that I find that you get from this are very pleasing, and importantly, they don't ruin the contrast of the whole image. So you can still shoot this with a little bit of backlight, and you're not going to you know, regret it later on. For video shooters, the focus breathing on the AF Nikkor is pretty bad, to be honest. It does focus breathe a lot, so unless you like that, when you're shooting video, you are probably going to want to avoid it. And really ergonomically, the bit where this lens falls down is the focus ring. The manual focus ring is very small. It's like super, super light. It needs a lot more damping, and that was one of the main criticisms with this lens when it came out. And I think that is probably its biggest downfall. Now, in terms of downfalls as well, it's worth mentioning that at 35mm, this lens displays a fair amount of distortion, a little bit of vignetting, but not a crazy amount. But the distortion at 35mm does end up disappearing as you zoom into 50 and 70mm. So there you go. Overall, I love shooting with this Nikkor whenever I get it out. The manual focusing experience leaves a lot to be desired, which is why I don't take it out too often. But you know, when you do, you can stop it down, and it is just a really compact zoom lens that's, you know, super light at 240 grams. And you know, the great thing is this is lighter and smaller than lots of modern Nikkor full frame lenses as well. So it's actually still a pretty viable option if you just want to get some, you know, not crazily sharp, but sharp enough, valid, usable shots, whether you're shooting photo or video. And I particularly like this lens as well. When you're at 35mm, stop down a little bit for video. I think that's where it really, really shines. But guys, let me know, do you have a Nikkor 35 to 70mm? I want to know in the comments. And remember to subscribe to Soviet Lens Reviews on YouTube. While you're at it, I've got some exciting Soviet lenses coming up to review very, very shortly. So hopefully you'll see those soon. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.